December 4, 1944. Eastern Philippine Sea. The pre-dawn sky hung heavy with moisture, the kind that made flight suits cling to skin and turned cockpit glass into mirrors of condensation. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima Tadashi sat in the cramped cockpit of his Yokozuka D-4Y dive bomber, third in a formation of 18 aircraft lifting off from the carrier Zu. The engine's rumble vibrated through his spine as the deck crew signaled final clearance. Around him, the Philippine Sea stretched endless and dark, swallowing the horizon in shades of charcoal and ash. His orders were precise: locate and destroy American carrier formations operating east of Leyte Gulf. Intelligence had confirmed Essex-class carriers in the area, the massive floating cities that had become symbols of American industrial might. But as his squadron climbed through the cloud layer at 8,000 feet, the radio crackled with confusion. The accent was wrong. The call signs didn't match American patterns. And then, through a break in the clouds, Nakajima saw them. 4 carriers steaming in tight formation, their flight decks swarming with aircraft that looked different, angular, predatory in ways he hadn't encountered before. These weren't American ships. The silhouettes were wrong, the profiles too compact. And in that moment of recognition, something cold settled in his chest that had nothing to do with altitude. These were British carriers, and every pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had learned to fear them in ways that transcended even the massive American task forces they'd been fighting since Midway. The war in the Pacific had taught Japanese aviators many harsh lessons about their enemy, but none proved more psychologically devastating than the arrival of the British Pacific Fleet in late 1944. For 3 years, Japanese pilots had adapted to fighting Americans. Their tactics, their aircraft, their overwhelming numbers. The American carriers were massive, vulnerable in certain ways, predictable in their defensive patterns. They caught fire. They could be damaged. At Santa Cruz in October 1942, Japanese aviators had proven that concentrated attacks could cripple even the mighty Enterprise-class ships. The carrier Hornet had been sent to the bottom. The Americans bled, and where there was blood, there was hope. But the British carriers operated under different physics, different rules of engagement that seemed to mock everything Japanese pilots had learned about carrier warfare. They were smaller, yes, carrying fewer aircraft than their American counterparts, but they possessed something that turned every attack into a nightmare of futility and despair. Armored flight decks, not wooden planking laid over steel frameworks like American and Japanese carriers, but solid steel plates, 3 inches thick, that could withstand bomb hits that would gut an American ship. The psychological impact of watching a 250-kilogram bomb detonate against that steel, seeing the flash and smoke, feeling the brief surge of triumph, and then witnessing the British carrier simply continue operations as if nothing had happened. This broke something fundamental in the attacking pilot's understanding of what was possible. The British Pacific Fleet, designated as Task Force 57 when operating under American command, arrived in Pacific waters with 4 fleet carriers, indomitable, victorious, indefatigable, and illustrious. Each represented a design philosophy utterly alien to Japanese naval aviation, where American carriers emphasized maximum aircraft capacity and striking power, accepting vulnerability as a calculated risk. The British Admiralty had designed their carriers to survive. The armored flight deck wasn't merely protective plating. It was the structural backbone of the entire ship, an integrated system that sacrificed hangar space and aircraft capacity for something the Japanese had never prioritized: survivability. A typical Essex-class American carrier could operate 90 to 100 aircraft. The British carriers averaged 40 to 50, but those 40 aircraft launched from platforms that could absorb punishment no Japanese pilot had ever witnessed a carrier withstand. At Okinawa, the kamikaze attacks that had sent American carriers limping back to Pearl Harbor for months of repairs merely dented British flight decks, leaving scratches that could be swept clear in minutes. Nakajima had heard the stories from survivors of earlier engagements. At Sakishima Gunto in March 1945, Japanese Special Attack Forces had launched wave after wave of kamikazes against the British carriers screening the American landing forces. The reports that filtered back to the combined fleet were almost impossible to believe. Direct hits that should have torn through flight decks and detonated in packed hangars merely created blast patterns on the steel surface. One pilot, dying in the sickbay of a submarine that had rescued him from the water, described watching his Wingman Zero smash directly into HMS Illustrious at full speed, the explosion consuming the aircraft in a fireball that rolled across the carrier's island superstructure. The attacking pilots had cheered, certain the British ship was finished, but through the smoke and flame, the carrier had emerged with superficial damage, her flight deck crews already pushing wreckage overboard, ready to resume operations within an hour. The dying pilot had wept as he described it, not from his wounds but from the crushing futility of dying for an impact that meant nothing. This was the psychological weapon the British wielded more effectively than any bomb or bullet, the absolute negation of sacrifice's meaning. The cultural dimension of this trauma cannot be understated. Japanese military ideology in World War II was built on the concept that spirit could overcome material disadvantage, that courage and dedication to the emperor could bridge gaps in industrial capacity and technological sophistication. The kamikaze doctrine itself emerged from this philosophy. If one pilot and one aircraft could sink a carrier, then Japan's remaining aviation strength could still alter the war's trajectory. American carriers validated this belief. However, tragically, they burned spectacularly. The USS Franklin, hit by 2 bombs in March 1945, suffered over 800 casualties and nearly capsized. She was saved only by heroic damage control and had to withdraw from combat entirely. When kamikaze pilots died attacking American ships, their deaths carried weight, achieved results that Japanese commanders could point to as validation of the special attack doctrine. But British carriers mocked this entire philosophical framework. They didn't just resist Japanese attacks, they absorbed them with an indifference that reduced individual sacrifice to meaningless gesture. A kamikaze strike that would gut an American carrier merely scratched paint on a British flight deck. The mathematical calculus of exchanging one life for one ship collapsed into absurdity when that ship simply refused to acknowledge the exchange had occurred. British flight deck crew procedures amplified this psychological impact through sheer efficiency that bordered on the supernatural. From a Japanese perspective, American damage control was excellent, built on training and redundancy, but it remained reactive. Damage occurred, and teams responded. British carriers operated on different principles. When a kamikaze hit HMS Indefatigable on April 1, 1945, the strike killed 14 men and created a 3-foot depression in the flight deck armor. Japanese observation aircraft circling the task force radioed that the British carrier was seriously damaged and withdrawing. 40 minutes later, that same carrier was launching air operations. The flight deck crew had simply filled the depression with quick-setting concrete, smoothed it level, and resumed business. To the watching Japanese pilots, this wasn't damage control, it was black magic. How do you fight an enemy whose ships refuse to die? How do you maintain morale among pilots trained to believe their sacrifice matters when the enemy's carriers treat their ultimate attacks as minor inconveniences? The aircraft operating from British carriers carried their own terror. Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to American fighters. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was a formidable opponent but predictable. The Vought F-4U Corsair, deadly but straightforward in its aggression. British naval aviation introduced different nightmares. The Supermarine Seafire, the carrier-adapted version of the legendary Spitfire, possessed a performance profile that caught Japanese pilots completely off guard. It accelerated faster than the Hellcat, climbed better than the Corsair, and turned inside the Zero at medium altitudes. But more unsettling than its performance was its appearance in places Japanese pilots had been taught no fighters could operate. British carriers, with their shorter flight decks and armored construction, seemed unlikely platforms for high-performance fighters. Yet the Seafires appeared everywhere, diving out of cloud cover, slashing through bomber formations with a viciousness that suggested their pilots fought with something beyond tactical professionalism. There was a fury in British combat flying, a barely controlled violence that Japanese aviators found deeply disturbing. Where American pilots fought with calculated aggression, British naval aviators fought like men settling personal scores. The Fairey Barracuda, torpedo bomber, represented a different kind of threat entirely. Japanese pilots had learned to intercept American torpedo bombers. The Douglas TBF Avenger was slow, predictable in its attack profile, vulnerable to fighters if caught before dropping ordnance. The Barracuda was equally slow, but it operated with a flexibility that made interception nightmarish. British torpedo doctrine emphasized low-altitude approaches in coordinated waves. using terrain masking and cloud cover in ways American squadrons rarely attempted. More disturbing was the Barracuda's willingness to operate in weather conditions that grounded American strike groups. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American and Japanese carrier forces clashed in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, weather had limited engagement parameters. Both sides waited for conditions that allowed their aircraft to operate safely, but British carriers operating in the Indian Ocean and later in the Pacific launched strikes in squalls and storms that Japanese meteorologists insisted made flight operations suicidal. Yet the Barracudas came through rain and low visibility, materializing out of weather fronts to drop torpedoes with mechanical precision before vanishing back into the clouds. Fighting an enemy who ignored weather wasn't just tactically challenging, it suggested a disregard for natural limitations that bordered on unnatural. The Fairey Firefly reconnaissance fighter added layers of paranoia to Japanese defensive calculations. American carrier air groups separated their functions. Fighters fought, dive bombers attacked ships, torpedo bombers hit from low altitude. But the Firefly combined roles with unsettling efficiency. It served as a long-range reconnaissance platform, a strike aircraft capable of carrying heavy bomb loads, and a capable fighter where necessary. More importantly, its radar gave it all-weather capability that terrified Japanese pilots who had learned to use clouds and night as sanctuary. During the Palembang oil refinery raids in January 1945, British carriers launched Firefly strikes through weather so thick that Japanese fighters couldn't scramble to intercept. The raiders appeared over the refineries as if materializing from solid cloud, dropped their bombs with devastating accuracy, and vanished before Japanese defenses could organize response. The psychological impact of fighting an enemy who could see through clouds, who operated in conditions that grounded your own aircraft, who seemed to exist partially outside normal physical constraints. This corroded morale more effectively than kill ratios ever could. But technology alone doesn't explain the fear British carriers inspired. The cultural dimension ran deeper, touching on aspects of British military tradition that Japanese intelligence services struggled to analyze effectively. British naval aviation in World War II carried with it traditions reaching back centuries, an institutional memory of sea combat that predated carrier warfare by generations. The Royal Navy had been ruling waves and fighting colonial wars, while Japan was still in self-imposed isolation. This historical depth manifested in combat doctrine that confused Japanese tactical analysts precisely because it wasn't purely logical or technological, it was cultural. British carrier tactics emphasized close-range engagement, tight defensive formations, and an aggressive pursuit of damaged enemy vessels that American commanders found reckless, where American carrier doctrine prioritized force preservation, launching strikes from maximum range to minimize risk to the carriers themselves. British commanders operated their ships as if they were battleships, closing two ranges that made Japanese submarine commanders salivate, accepting risks that American naval doctrine considered unacceptable. This aggressive positioning wasn't recklessness born of desperation. It was confidence rooted in those armored flight decks. British carriers could afford to operate closer to hostile air bases because they could absorb the resulting attacks. At Okinawa, American carriers maintained positions 60 to 80 miles offshore, launching strikes at the limits of their aircraft range to minimize exposure to kamikaze attacks. British carriers steamed within 40 miles of Japanese airfields, close enough that their defensive fighter patrols could intercept enemy formations before they organized for attack runs. This forward positioning created a psychological pressure on Japanese pilots that American distance never achieved. When you took off to attack an American carrier, you had time to compose yourself, to accept your fate, to transform fear into resolve. But British carriers were simply there, inescapably present. Their fighter patrols visible from Japanese airfields, a constant reminder that the enemy wasn't distant or abstract, but immediate and patient. They weren't running. They were daring you to come out and die. The class dynamics within British carrier operations added another layer of alien otherness from a Japanese perspective. Japanese military culture emphasized hierarchy and discipline, but within a framework of shared sacrifice and national unity. Officers and enlisted men came from different social strata, yes, but all served the emperor as instruments of a unified will. British carrier crews operated within class structures that Japanese observers found utterly baffling. Officers were recruited from the public schools and universities, representing Britain's traditional ruling classes. Enlisted ranks came from working-class backgrounds, bringing with them labor union traditions and a casual disrespect for authority that shocked Japanese prisoners who witnessed it. Yet somehow this system produced naval crews whose efficiency and professionalism exceeded anything in Japanese experience. British flight deck crews operated with a casual competence that looked like chaos but delivered results with mechanical precision. Officers gave orders in accents that signified Oxford and Cambridge, while engine room crew responded in dialects from Glasgow and Liverpool that Japanese interpreters couldn't pass. The class divisions seemed like they should create friction, inefficiency, weakness. Instead, they produced something frighteningly effective, a military machine that combined aristocratic leadership with working-class endurance, creating crews who could absorb horrific casualties and simply carry on with business. The tea ceremony became a symbol of British psychological resilience that Japanese intelligence reports struggled to convey without sounding absurd. Multiple Japanese pilots recovered from the water after failed attacks reported the same surreal detail. British carriers continued their tea service, even during action stations, where American ships went to general quarters with coffee and sandwiches distributed to battle stations. British carriers maintained their ritual afternoon tea, complete with cups and saucers, even as their gunners shot down incoming aircraft. One rescued Japanese pilot, interrogated aboard HMS Indomitable after being fished from the sea following a failed kamikaze run, reported watching British sailors calmly drinking tea from china cups while loading anti-aircraft ammunition. The interrogator assumed he was suffering from shock or trauma-induced hallucination, but the reports kept coming from different pilots, different engagements, all describing the same impossible scene: British crew members maintaining peacetime routines in the middle of combat operations. To Japanese military culture, which emphasized total martial focus during battle, this casual continuation of civilian habits during combat wasn't just odd, it suggested either insanity or a level of psychological dominance so complete that the British literally didn't regard Japanese attacks as worthy of interrupting their tea break. The architectural differences in carrier design carried symbolic weight beyond their tactical implications. Japanese carriers were beautiful in their way, elegant expressions of naval engineering with graceful lines and efficient profiles. American carriers were industrial, massive, ugly in their utility, but impressive in their scale. British carriers were fortresses, brutal in their functionality, intimidating in their compact power. The armored flight deck wasn't hidden below planking or disguised behind cosmetic elements. It was visible, obvious, a 3-inch thick steel message that said explicitly, "We built this ship to take damage and survive." The psychological impact of attacking such a target was profound. When a Japanese pilot lined up his dive bomber on an American carrier, he aimed at something that looked vulnerable. Massive, yes, but fragile in its way. A floating city that would burn. When that same pilot approached a British carrier, he saw battleship architecture, fortress walls, medieval castle logic applied to naval aviation. The target itself communicated invulnerability before the first shot was fired. British carrier fighter direction represented another technological advantage that created psychological pressure far beyond its tactical utility. The British had pioneered carrier-based radar fighter control, developing systems that allowed controllers deep in the armored bowels of the ship to vector defensive fighters onto incoming threats with uncanny accuracy. Japanese pilots, accustomed to attacking American carriers where fighter patrols operated on visual contact and limited radio coordination, found British defensive patterns bewildering. Fighters appeared from empty sky, diving from perfect intercept angles, anticipating attack formations before they committed to final runs. It felt like fighting an enemy who could read minds, who knew your intentions before you executed them. The reality was sophisticated radar and excellent crew training, but the effect on Japanese morale was profound. You couldn't surprise British carriers, you couldn't sneak through defensive gaps or exploit coordination failures. The carriers saw everything, knew everything, directed their fighters with machine precision. Attacking such a system didn't feel like combat. It felt like flying into an execution mechanism designed specifically to destroy you. The British Pacific Fleet's logistics train added yet another dimension to Japanese psychological disadvantage. American carriers operated from secure bases in Pearl Harbor, Ulithi, and eventually Okinawa, with supply lines stretching back to California shipyards and industrial centers. If damaged, American carriers withdrew to those bases for repairs, but British carriers operated from floating bases, fleet train auxiliary vessels that carried fuel, ammunition, spare aircraft, and repair facilities. The British Pacific Fleet could sustain itself indefinitely without returning to friendly ports. This operational independence meant British carriers never withdrew, never left their patrol stations, never gave Japanese forces respite from their presence. They were simply there, day after day, launching strikes, intercepting attacks, absorbing damage that would sink other ships, and continuing operations with a mechanical inexorability that ground down Japanese morale. You couldn't outlast them. You couldn't wait for them to withdraw for resupply. They had become permanent fixtures of the Pacific theater, immovable objects against which Japanese aviation exhausted itself in waves of futile sacrifice. The evolution of British carrier doctrine during the Pacific Campaign demonstrated adaptability that Japanese intelligence services found deeply threatening. When British carriers first arrived in the Pacific theater, American commanders worried they would be liabilities, requiring protection from American forces while contributing little to strike capabilities. Their smaller air groups and unfamiliar tactics seemed likely to complicate coordination rather than enhance it. But British carrier task forces proved themselves immediately during operations against Japanese oil facilities in Sumatra and later during the Okinawa campaign. They absorbed roles American carriers couldn't or wouldn't accept, operating in restricted waters close to hostile shores, maintaining constant combat air patrols over invasion beaches, providing air cover in weather conditions that grounded American squadrons. More disturbingly, from a Japanese perspective, British tactics evolved rapidly, incorporating American doctrine where it proved effective, while retaining uniquely British elements that amplified their operational flexibility. By mid-1945, British carriers operated with American-style deck cycles, launching large strike packages with American efficiency, while retaining their armored protection and aggressive positioning. They had become hybrid threats, combining American scale with British invulnerability. The kamikaze doctrine's failure against British carriers represented more than tactical defeat. It was philosophical collapse. The special attack units were Japan's answer to overwhelming material disadvantage, a way to leverage courage and sacrifice against industrial superiority. One pilot, one plane, one ship. The mathematics seemed almost fair, achievable despite resource constraints. American casualties validated this calculus. USS Bunker Hill suffered 389 killed and 264 wounded from a single kamikaze hit. In May 1945, USS Franklin nearly capsized, with over 800 casualties. These were military victories that justified the sacrifice, gave meaning to the deaths of young pilots who flew their aircraft into American ships. But British carriers broke this equation. Kamikaze hits that gutted American carriers merely scratched British flight decks. Pilots who died attacking HMS Indomitable or HMS Victorious died for nothing, achieving no strategic effect, no tactical advantage, no meaningful exchange of sacrifice for result. This devaluation of death was more demoralizing than any battlefield defeat. Japanese military culture could accept dying gloriously in service to the emperor. It could not accept dying meaninglessly against an enemy whose ships refused to acknowledge the sacrifice. The sound of British carriers became its own form of psychological warfare. American carriers generated sounds familiar to Japanese sailors: aircraft engines, steam catapults, the distinctive roar of piston fighters taking off. But British carriers produced different acoustics. The armored flight deck changed everything, creating a resonant steel drum that amplified certain frequencies while deadening others. British aircraft operations generated deeper, more percussive sounds that carried across water differently than American patterns. Japanese submarine commanders reported they could identify British carriers by sound alone, distinguished from American task forces by acoustic signatures that seemed more solid, heavier, more metallic. And there was another sound, reported in multiple after-action reports from Japanese pilots who survived attacks on British carriers. A distinctive ringing tone when bombs hit armored flight decks, like striking an enormous bell. American carriers exploded when bombs hit. British carriers rang. That sound, the deep metallic resonance of a bomb detonating against 3 inches of steel armor, became a symbol of futility, more eloquent than any tactical analysis. It was the sound of your weapon failing, your sacrifice meaningless, your courage insufficient. British carrier damage control procedures emerged from centuries of naval tradition and years of desperate warfare in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. By the time British carriers arrived in the Pacific, their crews had survived attacks by German aircraft, Italian torpedo bombers, and U-boat wolf packs. They had fought through Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Mediterranean battles off Malta. This combat experience produced damage control doctrines that emphasized immediate action over careful planning, aggressive response over procedural caution. When HMS Formidable took a kamikaze hit during Okinawa operations, the flight deck crew attacked the resulting fire with foam and chemical agents. Before damage control teams could even reach the site, officers coordinated response not from distant command centers but from the flight deck itself, directing operations while exposed to burning aviation fuel and exploding ammunition. This forward leadership style, officers leading from the point of danger rather than directing from safety, created crew cohesion that Japanese military culture recognized and respected, even as it terrified them. These weren't conscripts following orders out of fear or duty. These were professional sailors who attacked fires and, flooding with the same aggressive confidence their fighter pilots brought to aerial combat, the modification programs that British carriers underwent between Atlantic and Pacific deployments revealed an institutional learning capacity that Japanese naval aviation lacked. By 1944, British carriers arrived in the Pacific with lessons learned from years of combat in European waters, but they didn't assume those lessons would translate directly to Pacific conditions. The Fleet Air Arm studied American carrier tactics, adopted elements that improved efficiency, and integrated them with British operational doctrine. Aircraft recovery procedures borrowed American innovations in deck handling that dramatically reduced turnaround time. Fighter direction systems incorporated American radar improvements. Even mundane elements like pilot ready room layout and briefing procedures evolved to combine British and American best practices. This doctrinal flexibility, this willingness to admit that others might have superior methods and to adopt them without concern for institutional pride, demonstrated a pragmatism that Japanese military culture found almost incomprehensible. Japanese doctrine in 1945 remained largely unchanged from 1941. Despite years of battlefield experience suggesting necessary modifications, British carriers evolved continuously, becoming more dangerous with every operation, learning from each engagement, adapting to new threats with a speed that suggested institutional genius rather than individual brilliance. The relationship between British carriers and American task forces created additional psychological pressure on Japanese aviation planning. American carriers operated in large task groups, presenting massive targets that Japanese intelligence could track and attack with concentrated force. But British carriers integrated into American formations without surrendering their operational independence. They could detach for independent operations, reform into British task forces, or operate as integrated elements within American carrier groups, shifting roles and organization with a fluidity that made targeting calculations nightmarish. Japanese strike planners facing an American task force knew what they were fighting. X number of carriers, Y number of aircraft, Z defensive arrangement, following predictable American doctrine. But when British carriers were present, all calculations became uncertain. Would they operate independently, requiring separate strike packages? Would they integrate with American formations, adding armored survivability to American striking power? Would they detach to screen flanks, creating additional defensive layers that had to be penetrated? This operational unpredictability forced Japanese planners to prepare for multiple contingencies, dispersing striking power, reducing the concentrated force necessary to overwhelm American carrier defenses. British pilot culture added another layer of alien otherness that Japanese intelligence struggled to analyze. American naval aviators were professionals, trained and competent, but they operated within recognizable military frameworks. British Fleet Air Arm pilots seemed to exist outside normal military hierarchies. Many were Royal Air Force pilots on secondment to naval service, bringing with them RAF traditions of calculated recklessness and dark humor that contrasted sharply with Royal Navy discipline. Others came from Commonwealth nations, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, with colonial chip-on-shoulder attitudes toward British authority that somehow translated into aggressive combat effectiveness, and threading through all of it was a particularly British form of understatement that Japanese interrogators found maddening. British pilots described running battles with overwhelming Japanese forces in the same tones. They might discuss cricket matches or weekend hunting trips. A pilot who had shot down 3 Zeros and bombed 2 Japanese destroyers in a single sortie would characterize the mission as reasonably exciting or a decent show. This emotional restraint, this refusal to acknowledge danger or celebrate victory with anything approaching enthusiasm, suggested either profound psychological discipline or a fundamental disconnect between experience and emotional response. Either possibility was unsettling. The technological sophistication of British carrier aviation revealed itself in small details that accumulated into comprehensive advantage. British carriers pioneered deck landing aids that made aircraft recovery possible in conditions that would ground American operations. The Mirror Landing Site system, developed from British wartime research, allowed pilots to judge approach angles with precision, even in low visibility. British carriers incorporated improved arresting gear that reduced aircraft damage during recovery, keeping more planes operational. Even small innovations like improved deckage, safety nets, and crash barriers reduced aircraft losses, maintaining operational strength where American carriers saw steady attrition. These weren't dramatic technological breakthroughs. They were incremental improvements that demonstrated systematic attention to detail, institutional commitment to efficiency, and the accumulated wisdom of decades of carrier operations. Fighting an enemy who had optimized every element of carrier aviation down to the smallest detail communicated a message of comprehensive superiority more demoralizing than any single defeat. By April 1945, as Japanese military leaders planned Operation Quetzalcoatl, defense of the home island's British carriers occupied a special category in strategic planning distinct from American threats. American carriers were overwhelming in number and capability, but they operated according to understandable logic. You could plan defenses against American carrier strikes, could anticipate attack patterns, could calculate sacrifices necessary to inflict meaningful damage. British carriers operated outside these calculations. They appeared where Japanese planning insisted carriers couldn't operate. They survived damage that should destroy them. They maintained operations in conditions that should ground them. Planning defenses against British carriers felt like planning to fight ghosts or natural disasters you could prepare. Yes, but you couldn't really believe your preparations would matter. This psychological dominance, this aura of near invincibility, made British carriers force multipliers far beyond their actual numbers. For British fleet carriers operating off Okinawa, tied down Japanese defensive planning to a degree disproportionate to their striking power, because Japanese commanders couldn't predict what they would do or calculate reliable methods of stopping them. The final irony of Japanese fear of British carriers lay in understanding why that fear existed despite British carriers' actual tactical inferiority. 2 American fleet carriers in certain measurable categories. American carriers embarked larger air groups, could launch more powerful strikes, had better aircraft in many roles, and operated within a logistics system that dwarfed British capabilities. On paper, American carriers were more dangerous. But warfare isn't fought on paper, and psychological factors transcend technical specifications. British carriers were frightening, not because they could strike harder than American carriers, but because they couldn't be hurt in return. They negated the fundamental exchange that gave Japanese tactics meaning: sacrifice for effect. Against American carriers, kamikaze pilots died, but achieved results that mattered strategically. Against British carriers, they simply died. This distinction, this nullification of sacrifice's meaning, created fear beyond rational tactical assessment. It wasn't about ship numbers or aircraft capacity. It was about fighting an enemy whose ships refused to acknowledge you could hurt them, who absorbed your ultimate weapons with casual indifference, who communicated through their very existence that your sacrifice meant nothing. Eastern Philippine Sea, December 4, 1944, dawn breaking. Lieutenant Commander Nakajima pulled his formation into a shallow climb, delaying the inevitable decision. Below and behind him, his squadron waited for attack orders. Ahead, those 4 British carriers steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks already launching aircraft, radar antennas rotating in mechanical arcs, ready. He thought about the pilots in his squadron, young men who trusted his leadership, who believed their sacrifices would matter, who had written final letters to families and prepared themselves to die gloriously for the Emperor. He thought about those armored flight decks, about bombs detonating harmlessly, about the metallic ringing sound survivors described, about British sailors drinking tea while his friends died in flames. He thought about the cruiser tone of British radio transmissions he could hear through his headset, calm and professional and utterly unconcerned with his presence. And in that moment, suspended between duty and futility, between honor and meaningless death, Nakajima understood what Japanese military leadership had refused to acknowledge. They were not fighting just for victory anymore. They were fighting to make their dying matter, to find meaning in sacrifice against an enemy whose ships refused to grant them even that small dignity. He toggled his radio transmitter, began issuing attack orders his training demanded, and knew with certainty that whatever happened in the next 20 minutes, those British carriers would still be there when it was over, steaming in formation, launching aircraft, utterly unconcerned with his ultimate sacrifice. The ocean keeps its secrets, but history remembers this, that in the vast mathematics of industrial warfare, where steel tonnage and production capacity determined outcomes, the most devastating weapon wasn't bomb or bullet, but futility itself. Japanese pilots feared British carriers not because they were unbeatable. No ship is truly invincible, but because they were indifferent to sacrifice, indifferent to courage, indifferent to the meaning young men needed their deaths to carry. That indifference, that armored refusal to acknowledge sacrifice's value, broke spirits more thoroughly than any defeat in battle. It proved what Japanese military ideology couldn't accept, that sometimes courage isn't enough. That sacrifice without effect is just death without meaning. That spirit cannot overcome steel when that steel refuses to bend. The British carriers understood this truth instinctively, built it into their hulls and armored decks, and sailed into history, carrying it like a banner. They were fortresses that flew aircraft, castles that moved across oceans, medieval walls remade in steel and welded to 20th century warfare. And against such fortifications, built not just to resist, but to endure, to absorb and survive and continue regardless of opposition, courage became just another word for futility, and honor just another casualty of armored indifference.